All right, guys, as we get started with Chapter 8, we have our framework for government and we have a constitution. But also within that constitution, we have a Bill of Rights that guarantees personal liberties, beginning with the First Amendment and the right to freedom of speech. So we have representation defined, we have other things defined, but there's still yet more to do if we're going to have a strong centralized government that is going to make good on its promises. Also, there need to be instances where the United States can exercise its good on its promises. So that's where we begin with Chapter 8 in a discussion about what now comes next, given that the United States now has that framework for government. And how does the United States take the next step? How do we expand possibly our territory? Who becomes the next president after George Washington? How are all these things defined? How are elections defined? We're going to find out in Chapter 8. So as we share screen, let's go to Chapter 8 and you'll see exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, so New Orleans. In 1803, you'll notice that there's an American flag right here. New Orleans is not founded by the United States. New Orleans has been, in effect, founded by the French near the mouth of the Mississippi River 100 or so years prior. And so, how does it become American? We're going to get there here in just 1 second. So, we're going to talk about the next steps in American history to found our banks, who becomes the next president, who becomes the president after that, and do we fight another war for independence, perhaps? And if so, how does that come about and how does it happen? That being said, though, our guy, Alexander Hamilton, remember the one on the $10 bill? Yeah, the guy from the Broadway show. Alexander Hamilton had a vision for the United States, not just of having a strong Federalist central party, he also wanted to create a national bank to where the United States could make good on all of its debts. It could also perhaps even out circulation. You had a bunch of states that were former colonies that had printed some of their own currency, and it wasn't necessarily good in various different parts. That being said, Alexander Hamilton wanted to do something about that. He wanted to create a treasury, a central bank. He also wanted to pay off America's Revolutionary era debts, pay them off, and begin a new debt structure for the American government. And in doing so, he would work to create a new national credit worthiness. So, what does credit worthiness mean? Say, for example, you take out a credit card and maybe you have a $500 limit. That means you can put $500 on it maximum, whether it's per month or otherwise. So the best thing you can do, having worked in the credit industry, is to take that credit card, buy $100 worth of stuff every month, and then at the end of the month when your bill is due, pay it off in full. Do not carry over a balance. The best thing to do would be to live within your means. Use that credit card, maybe take advantage of some of the rewards if you have any, like 1% cash back, 2%, maybe some traveler miles, hotel miles, something like that. Take advantage of some of those perks, but do not carry over a balance. That is based off of revolving credit, where you have compounded interest that on a daily basis grows and grows and grows. If you only make the minimum payments on your credit cards, you will never get out of debt. So the best thing to do, charge something on it every month and then pay it off in full every month. By doing so, you will establish a consistent payment history. You will also not ever go over your limit, which means that you're not going to be stretched too thin, and you will always have credit available. All of those things are going to build a credit worthiness that are going to increase your credit score and tell lenders and other creditors that you are a worthy risk. The higher your credit score, the better terms you'll be offered when you apply for things like a home loan or a car loan, an installment loan like a personal loan, anything else like that. You'll get better interest rates, which means you're going to pay less. You're going to pay less interest, which means it's going to cost you less. So the banks will make less money off of you, but it's money that they generally see as far more consistent, and they're willing to take that risk. So from that standpoint, you establish a credit worthiness. The longer you have a credit worthiness profile, the higher your credit score is going to be, as long as you make your payments on time, you live within your means, you have a low debt ratio. So from that perspective, yeah, over time, you'll have different types of debt, installment loans, mortgages, credit cards, and you'll be deemed as a better credit risk the more you take advantage of all those things I just mentioned. So Alexander Hamilton's idea was to do exactly that. He wanted to establish a credit worthiness for the United States government by the form of having a treasury. And he wanted to create the Bank of the United States, which is the precursor to today's Federal Reserve, which prints our money, circulates it, adjusts interest rates, borrowing rates, and whatnot, and basically has a hold on our economic condition and the way money is circulated within our country. So that was Alexander Hamilton's design as part of creating a very strong centralized government, is to have a bank that could also be utilized by wealthy people to invest their money in, thereby investing wealthy and impactful people in the success of the United States government. A lot of the critics of a centralized bank deemed that situation of being a place for ultra wealthy people to store their money as being a haven just for people to establish their elitism. Now the government is going to be directly invested in the success of its ultra wealthy people. That was a common criticism from people like Thomas Jefferson and even James Madison. And they're not wrong. Oftentimes, a centralized government can very well be what perhaps wealthy people utilize as a tool for them to hoard money and therefore power. That's a modern criticism of a lot of centralized bureaucratic endeavors today. So some things don't always change. But in this particular instance, Alexander Hamilton's creation of the Bank of the United States was designed for the United States to be able to pay off its debts, to pay people like Daniel Shays from Chapter 7, make good on our debts, make good on our promises, establish a new debt and new revolving ideology. From that standpoint as well, Alexander Hamilton was a fan of tariffs. Today, in 2025, you see Donald Trump enacting quite a number of tariffs that are designed to either collect tax revenues from international agencies and countries, or perhaps to promote internal manufacturing, to promote jobs within the United States. Those are the ideas behind tariffs. Now, whether or not they actually work in practice or if there's not any sort of retaliatory tariff, that's a discussion for a different day. But a tariff is designed to be a tax on imported goods, to collect money from imports, but also to encourage domestic manufacturing, thereby creating domestic jobs, and doing so keeping jobs here, money circulating here, creating new jobs, which create new taxpayers. But then also subsidizing various different aspects of factory development. So maybe you want to encourage businesses to start building here, and maybe you will offer to pay them certain amounts of money to get them kind of started in the form of a subsidy. That was Alexander Hamilton's design. And he wanted to levy taxes, by which starting with a tax on whiskey manufacturers. So if you were going to tax whiskey, you would do so in a way that now you have a government authority that can actually levy a tax. Okay. Thomas Jefferson did not view America as being a country that had a strong central government that was an everyday part of American lives. His idea was a limited federal government. Yes, having a federal government is critically important, but Thomas Jefferson viewed it as potentially being tyrannical, overarching. Also, it could be a tool for wealthy people just to hoard their status and wealth. And he's not entirely wrong. And unlike Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson believed in maybe less trade with Britain across the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe we need to expand westward across North America, perhaps towards the Pacific Ocean. Thomas Jefferson believed that the United States should ultimately expand westward to where we should have a Pacific coast. So maybe Thomas Jefferson believed kind of the opposite of Alexander Hamilton, in that less government, westward expansion. And Thomas Jefferson would bargain with Alexander Hamilton to accomplish all of those things. So Alexander Hamilton was right in wanting to create a central government and right in wanting to create a bank of the United States. Conversely, Thomas Jefferson was also right in that he believed that America is a country of independent farmers who can make decisions on their own without government interference. So a government that serves the interests of commercial capitalists could be manipulated by ultra wealthy people. Is there maybe perhaps some sort of mediation? Can we have maybe perhaps a little bit of both? That was Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton's compromise. One of the things that Thomas Jefferson criticized about Alexander Hamilton's plan was that a strong central bank really favored northern manufacturers, northern capital, northern approaches, northern elitism, and thereby making northerners in New York, New England, far wealthier. Thomas Jefferson wasn't from New York. He was from Virginia. And in doing so, he recognized Virginia and South as also having a critical aspect and piece of the United States. So, in order to placate some of the fears of all this northern expansion, Thomas Jefferson proposed we move the capital of the United States from Philadelphia to a location more central along the Atlantic coast, perhaps somewhere in the Chesapeake region. That's kind of equidistant between New England and the Carolinas and Georgia. Okay, it would also be accessible. There was a location on the Potomac River, not too far from the mouth of the river where it empties into the Chesapeake, that was determined to be an ideal location for a new capital. And so the nation's capital, in a compromise bargain between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, the U.S. capital would be moved to a new location to be named after George Washington. But in this case, Washington, the District of Columbia. You know today as Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. And it was originally designed to be the Paris of North America. It turned out to be anything but. However, that was the design at the time. And that was one of the ways that Alexander Hamilton could get enough of the Jeffersonian types to get behind some of his Federalist movement to placate their fears. Move the capital further south. Okay. So other things were going on around the world. The French, who had helped the United States obtain their independence by becoming involved in the American Revolution, were so inspired by what they saw from the Americans that the old French society saw to it that they could be inspired by a brand new fledgling baby of a country, the United States of America. France is a culture that's very proud. They're very proud of themselves. Just ask them. The French are very proud of themselves. They're so cultured. We have the sophisticated, the culture. We have the people, we have the Gaul. We are France. The French are very proud of themselves. However, they had enough humility to understand that the new United States is a big influence on the world scale. They developed a country from scratch. They created a system of government that had never been tried on the world scale before. They created a republic form of government that takes the very best of democracy and attempts to balance it and check it to give as many people representation as possible. That had never been tried on the true world scale before, and France took great reference within that. They were inspired by it. Okay. So popular was the American Revolution in France that it would inspire their own revolutionary movement to oust King Louis, to storm the doors of the Bastille. And on July 14th, 1789, you begin the French Revolution. And in doing so, you would have radical revolutionaries in France who would aim to overhaul the entire French system. So much so that it would cause another conflict between France and Britain. And they would fight various different wars in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution. The new French radical revolutionaries, they were out to prove that they were a player on the world scale. Okay, so from that perspective, we're going to pick on a bully and we're going to go after Britain. In the meantime, British naval vessels continued to harass American commercial vessels on the high seas and across the Atlantic Ocean. And in doing so, they were guilty of impressing American sailors. I don't mean impressing like, oh my gosh, that guy looks so sharp. He looks so cool. I'm impressed. No, in this case, impressment, basically, for lack of a better term, means to kidnap. You're going to capture, kidnap American sailors, commercial, civilian, or otherwise. You're going to force them into service for the British Royal Navy. That's impressment. And that was a big problem because the United States saw that France and Britain were at war with one another. And though France was our ally because of the revolution, by the early 1790s, these French radical revolutionaries were out to prove so much that they turned somewhat adversarial with the United States. And even though France was our ally, and if they were going to go to war with Britain, we wanted to prefer France, some of these French radical revolutionaries made it very difficult to do business with them, so much so that it caused a conflict between the US and France itself as well. So, from that standpoint, John Jay, one of the other writers of some of the Federalist Papers, was an American diplomat, and he negotiated a treaty with the British. The British had been impressing American sailors. We wanted a stop to it. We wanted to remain neutral in the French British conflict that erupted in the aftermath of the French Revolution. But the French had also been impressing American sailors. So they kind of went back on some of their peace and some of their partnerships. John Jay's treaty was negotiated in 1794 to put an end to British impressment of American sailors and to also remove British soldiers who had never left U.S. territory in the aftermath of the American Revolution. There were still British military outposts all along the Mississippi River and other places within the territorial United States. John Jay's treaty was designed, somewhat controversially, to negotiate with the British an alliance that would recognize British commercial naval supremacy. We would recognize that we would favor their goods to import as opposed to French or otherwise. And in the process, they are to stop impressing American sailors into service, and they're to remove their troops from U.S. territory on the western frontier. That was John Jay's treaty. France didn't like that so much. France didn't like how the Americans, you're not partnering with the British, we're fighting a war, you're supposed to be neutral. The French kind of didn't like certain aspects of our relations with the British, but they also made things quite difficult. So hold that thought because something's going to come to a head as a result. George Washington was elected president by Congress in 1788, and he served two political terms, two four-year terms as president. In 1796, after the end of his second term, he discussed uh, in his farewell address the risk of having political factions, in this case, political parties. The Federalists, spearheaded by people like Alexander Hamilton, and Republicans, spearheaded by people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Republicans of yesteryear are not the same as Republicans from 2025. There may be a few things that they would have similarly, but this is not the same political party. The Republican Party that you know today was founded in the 1850s by people like Abraham Lincoln under the name the Grand Old Party. And over time, the word Republican was used, and they had certain platforms that have evolved over the last 150, 60, 70 years or so, and now they're a different party. There are a couple things about that are similar with today's GOP with the Republican Party from the 1790s, but understand it's a pretty different party. The Federalists of the 1790s were the party of Hamilton who believed in strong centralized economic power with a strong centralized federal government, closer ties to Britain. Typically, you're going to have very wealthy businessmen, very wealthy farmers, landowners, northern political leaders, and more of your elite status. Wealthy people were far more likely to favor having a strong centralized government because now that government collected their money and now they were invested in the government's success. So if you were very wealthy, especially up north, you tended to favor the Federalist Party. In some ways, you can make a similar connection to today's Democrat Party. But you're developing political factions based on political interests. Republicans of yesteryear referred to Federalists as just a bunch of wealthy men holding office trying to fix the economy in their favor. They weren't quite wrong, but George Washington warned, maybe perhaps, about some of these political interests in political parties, Federalists and Republicans. Today, you have two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Yeah, you have the Green Party, you have the Libertarian Party, sure you do. But you really have the two main political parties that are really kind of split. Today in 2025, the Democrat Party is really three different political parties. You have the Clinton corporate Democrats, which really gained prominence in the 1990s. You have your traditional bureaucrats, your FDR Democrats. That's really more of the heart and soul of the Democrat Party, the party that was there for America during the Great Depression in the 1930s. That's the heart and soul of the Democrat Party, the party of the little guy, the party where the government is there for people. And then there's the third wing, which is more of your progressive wing, or quote unquote your woke aspect of the Democrat Party. And these people drive a progressive agenda. Those three factions don't always get along with each other, but they need each other if they're going to have at least some of their platform move further in today's political party society. The Republicans today are really also three different political factions. You have your libertarian wing. These are people who prefer low taxes, if any taxations. The government should stay out of your pocketbook. They should also stay out of your bedrooms. They should enable free enterprise and trade and business and making money in a true capitalist free society. That's what libertarianism is. There's also your social conservative wing who are more in favor of putting prayers back in church. They're more likely to favor pro-life from an abortion standpoint, more of your socially conservative agenda, oftentimes tied to evangelism or otherwise. The third wing is now the most vocal wing of the Republican Party. And in 2025, that's your MAGA, your Make America Great Again, Trump movement. That's a popular political movement where you have certain values espousing an end to woke politics, this, that, or the other, an America First policy, which I can get behind to some extent. But some other things about it, I'm not quite behind. But otherwise, though, all three of those factions within the Republican Party need each other if they're going to at least have some of the things in their agenda to work for them, especially if they're going to counterbalance the Democrats and vice versa. That's a problem with political interests that George Washington alluded to in his farewell address. That being said, if you look here with the Whiskey Rebellion in the early 1790s, after Alexander Hamilton and the Bank of the United States and the Treasury had levied a tax on whiskey producers, you had a lot of farmers out in whiskey country producing whiskey or whatnot that pushed back against paying taxes on whiskey and taxing the manufacturing and production of whiskey. They pushed back and led a rebellion against the government. How dare you tax us? However, the Whiskey Rebellion was an example now in a time where the United States now had a formal federal government that could deploy U.S. Army troops to squelch any sort of rebellion. So there's a tale of two tales. Did I say that right? Tale of two tales, rather. You have Daniel Shays' rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. Daniel Shays' rebellion exposed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and a need for something far greater. The Whiskey Rebellion was as a result of the federal government taxing whiskey production and now deploying official legal U.S. troops to squelch that rebellion because now you can do something about it. So opposite ends of the spectrum here. You have the Shays Rebellion, which you need something greater, and the Whiskey Rebellion, that something greater is now putting its rubber stamp on things. So now the Whiskey Rebellion really was the first aspect of American history where our federal government had authority to put down rebellions. So this is General George Washington. He would become the first president of the United States, elected by Congress in 1788. Crucially important, one of the most prominent Americans. Just a great example of resilience and story, leadership, and camaraderie. That's George Washington who put everything together. Um, the Republican Party. This is the party of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believed that America was a country of small town farmers that were capable of self governance. They didn't need a strong centralized government in their face all day, every day. It's good that you have a federal government. Yes, that's good, especially in the era of a fledgling country. But he warned about possibly having a centralized government that would be invasive. And he's not wrong. So, from the standpoint, you have Thomas Jefferson, who believed more in like your small town America, your independent farmer, capable of making decisions independent from their federal government to understand what may be best for them, as opposed to a commercial capitalist in a place like Boston, where you have elites from the North making a lot of money. He believed that the federalist system that the Federalists espoused, with a strong central bank and central government, could be manipulated by ultra wealthy people to do their bidding and for the government to do their bidding. And he's not wrong. Oftentimes, when you have centralized power and overarching, you serve the interests of elites, you're going to create social inequality. He believed that Americans can achieve true freedom by being independent. So, yeah, we need a strong government, but let's not make it too strong. That was Thomas Jefferson's ultimate belief. And as such, he was more of a champion for American common people like you and me. So that is something that would embrace populism in the United States. Now, in 1796, as I mentioned a little bit ago, George Washington would step down. He would serve out 2 terms, 2 4-year terms as president. There was no authority that said George Washington couldn't return for another term as president. George Washington believed, though, that America's highest leaders should not serve as leader in perpetuity. He believed that could be somewhat, if not tyrannical, it could be somewhat totalitarian and authoritarian. So he believed in the idea of having term limits for America's executives. Today, you have countries like China, where Xi Jinping is the de facto leader of that country and will be in a perpetuity. He's made the laws to which he could serve out a life term. As of today, in October 2025, Xi Jinping has no intention of stepping down as leader of the Communist Party in China. I don't see that happening anytime soon, barring something catastrophic. So, from that standpoint, Xi Jinping is going to be the leader of that country for a long time. Vladimir Putin has been prime minister of Russia since 2000, so now 25 years. He's had elections, right? But all he's really produced is our elections, rather, that shows that he's a clear-cut winner, right? He's going to be prime minister and de facto leader of that country in perpetuity, unless something catastrophic happens. Maduro in Venezuela. Before him, it was Hugo Chavez. Um, you're going to have de facto rulers that will preside over their countries in perpetuity. George Washington did not believe that was the right course of action. And so he stepped down at the end of his second term, making way for a new person to be president of the United States. And in 1796, John Adams would run against Thomas Jefferson. And they ran under different political party ideology. John Adams was very much a Federalist. He believed in a strong centralized government, and he had the clout to go along with it. Thomas Jefferson was a Republican, and awkwardly in that election, which was pretty close, John Adams would receive the most votes, therefore the most electoral votes, and he would win the presidency. Thomas Jefferson had the second largest amount of electoral votes. In the 1790s, if you came in second in the Electoral College, you'd be named as vice president. Yay, fun times. The person who beat you is now your boss. There'd be something to change that. But I can only imagine in 2024, Kamala Harris, who was vice president of the United States, was Joe Biden's vice president. She ran for president again, 2024, or she ran for president rather. She lost to Donald Trump. Under the 1796 era laws, Kamala Harris would be vice president again under Donald Trump. That's going to change with the 12th Amendment. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Otherwise, though, John Adams wins the election of 1796, and he's somewhat immediately unpopular. See, he lacks the charisma of a George Washington. He lacks that sort of clout. And he presides as a Federalist over certain aspects that make him immediately unpopular, not just with Republicans, but his own Federalist Party and America at large itself. He favored stronger trade with Britain. Well, that would come to a head, especially as the French were fighting a war with the British. And even though the United States wanted to appear neutral, he was quite leery, especially after John Jay's treaty had been signed a couple of years beforehand. So John Adams was known for the XYZ affair, where American diplomats would try and calm the waters in a quasi-war with France. French sailors were impressing American sailors as well as the British. And Adams sent delegates to squelch that. The problem is the French wanted bribes to see that happen. And basically, John Adams and the XYZ affair just proved his ineffectiveness as president. He kind of bungled our French relationship, and it just kind of showed that the Federalists had a different ideology that didn't quite work with everyday Americans, especially with their relation with France. So that XYZ affair, you can read about it in your more time, was somewhat catastrophic. Also during this time, the Federalists who were in power of Congress and the presidency, they did whatever they could to squelch opposition. They passed the Alien Acts and also the Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts were passed to reduce immigration or otherwise to deport immigrants who are often viewed by Federalists as mere agents of France producing anarchy. You see, that French Revolution was liked by people like Thomas Jefferson, who believed that was the voice of common people. However, people like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and George Washington even believed that was anarchy. That's counterintuitive. So they believed that oftentimes immigrants were the voice of anti-federalism. So they wanted to remove them. Worse yet, were these Sedition Acts. And these Sedition Acts right here was where the Federalist Party really began to lose the American people. The Federalists, by passing the Sedition Acts, aimed to limit or eliminate, rather, criticism of the government, which at that point was run by the Federalist Party. If you, off the top of your head, wanted to scream that you hate Donald Trump, as long as you were not violent or threatening, you have a right to say that. You have a right to say, back in the Joe Biden era, the whole "let's go Brandon" stuff. It was kind of funny. You have a right to speak your mind. You have a right to protest. The Sedition Acts were meant to eliminate people from publicly assembling a riot or protest, if you will, that criticizes the Federalist government. The problem with the Sedition Acts were recognized by the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures. That's a violation of the First Amendment. You have a right to freedom of speech, including criticizing your own government. And like I said, as long as you're not violent and as long as you're not threatening, you have every right to speak your mind. If you see that the government is not doing your liking, you have a right to speak publicly about it and to criticize them. So the Sedition Acts were synonymous with the Federalist Party overarching and overreaching. They're trying to stifle and silence criticism. That's a violation of free speech. So people began to view the Federalist Party as being the party of hypercentralization and perhaps also the party of stranglehold on the American people. Okay? So in 1800, there would be a new election. John Adams would run for re-election, and then Thomas Jefferson would run against him again the second time. In this case, John Adams was not as popular. Thomas Jefferson won that election pretty handily. And Thomas Jefferson wins, and he is immediately the champion of the common people. So our guy Thomas Jefferson believes that Common people are the heart and soul of our country. Thomas Jefferson was not from a common background. Thomas Jefferson came from a very wealthy landowning company, or family rather. He owned a lot of land in Virginia. He owned a lot of slaves. He owned a lot of other properties that led him to be more prominent in Virginia society and therefore American society. Remember, this is the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence, or as I call the world's greatest breakup letter. So Thomas Jefferson was a person of status. Whether or not he cared about common people is one thing. He acknowledged common people and gave them a voice. And that's what made Thomas Jefferson so revered in American society, because everyday people like you and me could point to him and say, that guy sees me. Whether or not he cares, again, is one thing. But he acknowledges you, and he acknowledges your right to have a voice. And for a lot of people, that's enough. And that's one of the things that makes Thomas Jefferson revered in American society. Also, it would be under the Jeffersonian presidency where the 12th Amendment would be passed. This whole idea of the person receiving the second most electoral votes becomes vice president, that's going to go away with the 12th Amendment. Nowadays, you see a ticket, you have a president. In this case, Donald Trump ran for president, and he had J.D. Vance run as his vice president on the ticket. Kamala Harris ran for president, and has she come in second? She just comes in second. And so J.D. Vance becomes vice president of the United States when Donald Trump wins the election on a ticket. That's guaranteed by the 12th Amendment. So, what do we do about slavery? Again, slavery was inherited by the United States. Should we expand it? Should we emancipate slaves? Should we kind of kick the can down the road? And how do we justify slavery if we do so? Going on the late 1700s and the early 1800s was the Haitian Revolution. So there's the country of Haiti, formerly known as the French colony of Saint Domingue. So the island of Hispaniola on the western side is Haiti, and on the eastern side is the Dominican Republic. In the early 1800s, Haiti had a revolution where they ousted the French colonial authorities, thereby making almost entirely a region made up of French colonial slaves now their own country, made up of former slaves. Haiti immediately devolves into anarchy and chaos without French authorities there. And it became a cautionary tale. To this day, the country you know today as Haiti is in complete mess. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, and they can't quite ever seem to get things together. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, what was happening down in Saint Domingue, Haiti, was a cautionary tale. The pro-slavery movement argued that the Haitian Revolution, what was going on in Haiti, is a cautionary tale for emancipating slaves. It was thought at the time that a justification of slavery could be to where, well, obviously these former slaves, these black people, don't know how to manage themselves, therefore they're probably inferior, and without a white master, they just can't quite get themselves together. So in reality, we need to keep slaves in order, because if we free them, they're not going to integrate into society and they're not going to know what to do. That was the idea and one of the ways that slave owners justified continuing slavery. They pointed to Haiti and said, look what happens without us. That's a warped justification. Obviously, we know that today, but that was commonly believed at the time, and it was something that affected everyday American politics. Now, we've talked about the three branches of government: your legislative branch, your executive branch. We haven't really talked as much about the judicial branch. That's our system of federal courts, culminating with the U.S. Supreme Court. They've been kind of quiet by this time. However, there was a court case, Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court would oversee a court case where it was determined that a congressional act had violated the Constitution. And the Supreme Court would rule under the court case, Marbury versus Madison, that Congress, if it violates the Constitution, the Supreme Court can strike down congressional action, thereby putting a check on the legislative branch. John Marshall was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he was the de facto leader of all the judges. And he grew to prominence because in Marbury versus Madison, that was the first prominent Supreme Court case where the judicial branch flexed its muscles to check the legislative branch. So thereby introducing the judiciary as part of the balance that exists within the U.S. framework for government. And so you will want to know Marbury versus Madison and John Marshall for the judicial branch and their ascendance, their coming out party, if you will, Marbury versus Madison. Here's a map of the original Washington, D.C. It was deemed, oh, yeah, we're going to put this at the confluence of the Potomac River and this other stream right here. Here's Georgetown right there. Something's going to happen in Washington, D.C. in about 10 years or so. We'll take a look at that. Let's go back to the Louisiana Territory. You see, it's this territory in green that you see right here. This territory had been ceded to the Spaniards by France after the French and Indian War. So France lost all of their North American possessions, but they didn't lose it all to the British. They ceded New Orleans and this western drainage of the Mississippi River that you know as the Louisiana Territory, they ceded it to the Spaniards. So Spain controlled New Orleans for the better part of 40 years as this entire swath, the Midwest and prairie land of the United States. In this time in early 1803, there would be a new French leader emerging under the title of Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon would rise to power, and he wanted to restore French dominance, not just in Europe, but elsewhere across the world, and restore the French name. Napoleon Bonaparte would partake in a number of different European wars to get them back started on the world scale. And he needed money. Part of his design was to repopulate the Louisiana Territory in North America. He wanted to resettle with French settlements. However, he had a bigger problem. He needed to fund his wars in Europe. He was looking at annexing parts of modern-day Germany, Poland, and he even wanted to invade parts of Russia, which he would in the winter. Later on, we'll talk about Waterloo. Not good for Napoleon Bonaparte. But Napoleon, the French emperor, needed money. And so in 1803, American diplomats, spearheaded by John Jay, attempted to kind of ease some peaceful action with the French emperor, and Napoleon Bonaparte levied an offer, and it would be too good for people to pass up in the United States. So I pose this example. Say, for example, you have your dream car. I'm going to say it's an Aston Martin Vanquish. And a brand new Vanquish could cost anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 in 2025. That's a pretty penny. That's my dream car, by the way. If I won the lottery, you'd probably see me driving one of those. Say, for example, you can get your Vanquish. That's your dream. And you came across your dream car for sale. And the person who's selling your dream car in pristine condition is desperate for money. Maybe the guy's selling it because he's divorcing his wife and needs money for his legal fees. Or maybe he's got other things he wants to pay for medical bills or something like that. And he needs the money right away. So he's willing to sell that Aston Martin Vanquish, which might be $200,000. He's willing to sell it to you for $40,000. Pristine condition. It's new. He just wants to get rid of it because he needs cash immediately. That is essentially what happened with the Louisiana Territory. Napoleon Bonaparte needed money for his wars in Europe. And as such, he offered American delegates the Louisiana Territory, this entire drainage swath, for $15 million. France needed money. Delegates loved it. Thomas Jefferson, whose vision was to expand the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean, this would be right up his alley. The problem is the delegates didn't know if they had the constitutional authority to approve something like that. But in an act of act now and ask for forgiveness later, they agreed to Napoleon's term, and they were going to offer and pay Napoleon $15 million for that Louisiana territory, thereby immediately transferring this huge swath, essentially the western drainage of the Mississippi River Valley. And so big rivers, the Missouri, the Red River, which we know here in Texas, the Arkansas River, the Platte River, Yellowstone River, all the major tributaries that eventually drain into the Mississippi River and eventually out into the Gulf, that now would become part of the United States. Embarrassingly, our delegates didn't know if they could approve it. They just did it. When they reported back to Thomas Jefferson what they did, Thomas Jefferson had two reactions. The first one, he was ecstatic. This is exactly what he wanted. He wanted westward expansion of the United States to get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And this accomplishes a huge chunk of that. Obviously, that's a good thing. And so Thomas Jefferson was really pleased with it. The second thing is, Thomas Jefferson was also embarrassed. He didn't know if he himself, as president of the United States, could approve something like that. He didn't know if he had the constitutional authority. It just happened. So he was a little bit embarrassed, but more so than not, though, he was highly, highly pleased with the acquisition. It helps accomplish the overall goal of eventually expanding the United States from coast to coast. So instead of northward expansion or further trade with Britain, westward expansion was great. The Federalists despised everything about it. They saw an expansion of territory as being or as having potential down the line to compete with northern resources. They wanted to trade more with Britain. This westward expansion threatened their economic growth. Now you're gonna move assets further and further out west. That's going to dilute their power. So the Federalists were not on board with it at all. However, Thomas Jefferson believed we accomplished our goal of moving towards the Pacific, and we also really affirm the agrarian culture, the small town farmer, the independent farmer, as a true nature of the United States. So even though he questioned if it was constitutional, it just happened. And immediately Thomas Jefferson set out to explore this new territory. And he commissioned these two guys, Lewis and Clark, to set out from near modern day St. Louis and take a trek along this major tributary right here, the Missouri River, which is the largest tributary of the Mississippi. And at St. Louis, the Missouri empties into the Mississippi. But the further out west you go, you understand this Missouri River is navigable. You can sail up it, especially in smaller boats. And in doing so, you can explore all the way in through the modern American Midwest and prairie land in modern day places like Nebraska and the Dakotas or Kansas, Iowa, places like that, and then up into Montana, Idaho. Eventually, Lewis and Clark would want to see to it that they make their way all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, out here in the modern American Northwest, in the Columbia River Valley, that was disputed by several different empires at the time. However, Lewis and Clark would eventually make a pass all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. They would touch Pacific water. 2 years later, they would report back to Thomas Jefferson that they had explored so much greatness that exists out there. There's wide open prairies, there's buffalo everywhere, there's very fertile land and soil, and this is a great way for America to expand. There's so much potential here. And today, that region of the country is America's breadbasket. We grow all kinds of wheat. There's all kinds of other things, corn, other things that we do that feeds everyday Americans and really people all across the world. And it's these two guys, Lewis and Clark, that started that. This lady right here, that's Sacagawea. She was a Native American young lady, probably about a college student age, maybe younger. And she would help Lewis and Clark establish relations with native tribes, often serving as a translator or otherwise as a de facto familiar face for native tribes to help the settlers navigate waters and navigate relations, especially in certain parts of the prairies where maybe they weren't so keen on having white Europeans there. Let's go to the other side of the world. The United States was trading commercially all across the Atlantic world, oftentimes into the Mediterranean off the North African coast, also known as the Barbary Coast. So you had American trade vessels all throughout the Atlantic, and sometimes these trade vessels, when they would enter into the Mediterranean, they would be harassed by North African Barbary pirates. One of the reasons why navies exist is to protect your commercial assets on the high seas. You want to have naval vessels that can protect your commercial ships from being attacked by pirates or otherwise taken over. So this is why the United States today has the world's preeminent Navy. There is also an entity within the Navy in a different department that has more of an infantry aspect. And this infantry is known today as United States Marine Corps. The mission of the Marine Corps is to be a light expeditionary force that can be deployed on a moment's notice anywhere in the world at any time and in any condition to secure a situation, win, and eventually pull out. The Army is the military's biggest service. If you need a long-term occupational force with the breadth of logistics and different services, that's the Army. The Marines are not designed to do that. The Marines are designed to be quick, light, effective, and then move out. So Marines would be attached to naval vessels, and they would be called upon to secure the coast of Tripoli off of modern-day Libya to squelch a number of Barbary pirates that had been plaguing and attacking American troops. So this is where the Marine Corps anthem comes into play. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fought our country's battles on the air, on land, and sea. That is the beginning of the Marine Corps anthem. The reference to the shores of Tripoli is in reference to America's fighting against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean off the North African coast, fighting to protect American ships. Okay, and this is another depiction of Tripoli. So, other things are also happening at the time. Britain, we had tried to maintain relations with. They continue to impress American sailors, and they continue to make their point home that they're not going away. That's a problem. Britain continuously harasses American vessels. They also have not removed British troops in various parts of America. They had also made things very difficult for America to trade elsewhere with Europe. That's going to cause a stir. And eventually things would come enough to a head to where America would kind of forgive France for a lot of things. And we would declare war on Britain for a second time. And in 1812, the United States would declare war on Britain, known as the War of 1812, which would ironically end in 1814. They continued to assault American ships and do other things to make ourselves miserable. Eventually, the British would send more troops to the inland of the United States. Now, there weren't as many of them as what was happening in the 1770s and 80s, but they would eventually invade the United States. They would also make their way right here into the Chesapeake, where they would approach the new American capital, Washington, D.C., and they would burn it. They would burn the U.S. Capitol in 1812. Can you imagine today an invading force like the Russians or somebody like that invading Washington, D.C. and burning it to the ground? Because that's what happened in 1812, 213 or so years ago. That's what happened. So from that perspective, the United States was fighting against the British, and while our troops were away, other things were happening. The United States also saw opportunity up here in Canada. Many Americans believed that maybe by defeating the British, we could oust them and annex this portion of Canada right up here. There would be American military units that would engage against British Canadians. they would be beaten back pretty strongly. They made the message point clear. You are not part of Canada. You are not going to annex Canada. Okay. And it also reminded the Americans that maybe we don't need to expand northward. There's nothing but a bunch of cold territory anyway. Instead of going up north into Canada, we should expand further and further west. That also being said, the British burned Washington, D.C. to the ground, but there were other things happening. Eventually, the British would get worn down so much to where two things would happen. First of all, um, you have Baltimore. The United States had a major fort, Fort McHenry, there near the port of Baltimore, which was approachable by sea across the Chesapeake, but it was difficult to land. And during the War of 1812, the British had sent a large naval contingency to sack Fort McHenry. The problem is they couldn't actually get to it by land. So they stayed in the Boston harbor and they continually bombed Fort McHenry from the harbor. And at the entrance of Fort McHenry was a large United States flag. Overnight, the British from the harbor would bomb Fort McHenry. And you can see in this depiction the British lobbing bombs at the fort right here where this flag is. Bombs bursting in red air, or bombs bursting in midair, that sort of thing. Rockets, red glare, bombs bursting in midair. There was an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key, an attorney, who witnessed this, who witnessed overnight the British bombardment of Fort McHenry. That flag had been planted there. The next morning, after the dust had settled and the British had finished bombing it, that flag was still there. If that sounds like a familiar story, it should, because that's the basis for what is today the United States national anthem, also known as the Star Spangled Banner. Many people believe that the Star Spangled Banner was written in the American Revolution in the 1770s. Nope. 1812. The War of 1812, the bombing of Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore, gave inspiration for Francis Scott Key. When the British continually bombed it, that flag was there beforehand and it was still there the next day. That's a true story, but it's also metaphoric. The United States has seen all kinds of chaos. We've seen all kinds of things that threaten us. And yet, we endure. That flag was still there, enduring all that bombardment and chaos. The American people enduring chaos and difficult adversity. We're still there. It's a metaphor. So, based on a real event, the Star Spangled Banner was written as a result of the bombardment of Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore in the War of 1812. Also, New Orleans, right down here, a large British Army contingent occupied New Orleans. Colonel Andrew Jackson of the United States Army, Colonel from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, Old Ironside. He, Old Hickory, as he was known, would lead an American contingent to drive the British out of New Orleans and out to the Gulf of Mexico. So if you've ever been in New Orleans, you'll see right off of the French Quarter is Jackson Square. That is a monument that is in tribute to Andrew Jackson, who liberated New Orleans from the British, and thereby also ending the War of 1812. Ironically, a negotiated peace had been dealt already. News travels slowly. Point being, though, is that the Battle of New Orleans was won by the Americans, driving the British out and into the Gulf of Mexico, thereby ending the war, and the United States has defeated the British twice. Okay. As a result of the War of 1812, the United States decided we're not going to go after Canada. We don't want Canada. It's too cold up there anyway. Instead of going north, let's go west. And as you do so, you're going to expand territorially and economically in an area that's more temperate and more fertile. Okay. Also, the Federalist Party, who had resisted Louisiana Purchase, they had passed the Sedition Acts. They had favored trade with Britain, who we just went to war with. The Federalist Party had overreached. They started to wane in power, and eventually the Federalist Party would eventually dissolve. That being said, Chapter 8 is where a lot of things happened in the sense that the United States gained new territory. We went to war with Britain again and defeated them. We influenced the French for their own revolution. We created a central bank of the United States and created a central government that could now do something for its people and abroad. So, Chapter 8 is critically important. But otherwise, guys, you're going to want to know all these things for your exam. I would pay special attention to Alexander Hamilton, the Bank of the United States. I would pay attention to Jay's Treaty, impressment of sailors, um, the Sedition Acts, the XYZ affair. I would pay attention to that, and I would move forward from there. So, from that perspective, guys, that is all I have for you for Chapter 8. I wish you the best. Be on the lookout for a study guide, and we'll see you soon.